Welcome to today's webinar, Building a Python Serverless Application with AWS Chalice. Our presenter today is James Sayerwini. He's a senior software dev engineer with AWS DevTools. Today with us, we also have Kyle Knapp, who will be our webinar moderator and will be engaging with you and answering your questions throughout the presentations. James, welcome. The floor is now yours.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm James. I'm a software engineer on the AWS SDKs and tools team. And I primarily work on the AWS CLI, the AWS SDK for Python, as well as a couple of libraries and frameworks, one of which we'll be talking about today. So today we're looking at building a Python serverless application with AWS Chalice. And this webinar is really broken down into three different sections. First thing we're going to look at, I'm just going to go over how you can get started with Chalice, give you an idea of how it can help you write serverless applications. And then in the next two sections of this webinar, we're going to look at taking a really basic sample application and then evolve it from working on a dev laptop to working on your own resources, and then to setting up, finally in the third section, a full deployment pipeline so that you can automatically deploy your changes as soon as you push them to some remote Git repository. Now, before we dive into the content, just a couple of prerequisites. The first thing I want to mention is this is a Python framework written for Python developers, so we won't really spend a lot of time going over the Python code. So as long as you can follow along with Python code, you should be fine. And then the other thing is that I am assuming a little bit of really basic familiarity with Amazon API Gateway and AWS Lambda and how those two can be combined to create serverless REST APIs. We will cover the specific parts we need but I am assuming that you have some basic familiarity there. So with that being said, let's jump into the first section, which is getting started with Chalice. Now to start with, let's take a really simple example here. Let's say that I have a setup where I want to make a single GET request, and then I wanted to go through Amazon API Gateway into AWS Lambda and then return some JSON response for me. And if we think about how we would actually set this up, there's a number of components that need to come together in order to make this happen. Now, if you're familiar with all of the low-level resources here, you can hook up Amazon API Gateway and AWS Lambda, and then you have the integration with an AWS IAM role. And from there, you create a Swagger document, and you can create a deployment package that has all of your dependencies, and then use either CloudFormation or an AWS SDK, such as Boto 3, to make all of this happen. But really what we want is something that helps make that more streamlined. And this is where Chalice comes in. So Chalice is a Python framework for creating serverless REST APIs. It's fully open source on GitHub. And it offers a number of features, some of the big ones being a declarative routing API. So this makes it really easy to create REST APIs in a declarative way and have it through a code-first approach or code-driven approach. And then the other thing that Chalice provides is a CLI. So this helps with deployment and packaging and debugging and a number of other additional things that we'll look at in just a second. Now, that example that we saw just a second ago with making a simple GET request and then getting a JSON response, here's how you do that in Chalice. And it's just 5 lines of code here. And every Chalice app has the same basic components, and we'll walk through those now. So the first thing, every Chalice app, you have an app object, and that's here at the module level. And after that, there's a number of features that you can use in Chalice, but here we're going to show that you have one or more routes. And in those routes, you pretty much can do anything you want here. You can generate JSON, or we'll see a couple of other examples in just a second. But all of this goes into an app.py file. And once you do that, you can use a Chalice CLI. And you run Chalice deploy, and it will set everything up for you. And then eventually it will give you a URL that has your REST API up and running. So we went through that pretty quickly. What I'd like to do is show you a demo, and we'll switch over to demo here. Because I think it's really nice to just actually see the framework in action. So we're going to walk through that example just to show you how you would actually do this on your own. So first thing, I don't have anything set up, so we're going to go ahead and just start with a demo directory here. And in this demo directory, we're going to start with a virtual environment. So with most Python projects, we'll start with a virtual environment. And I'll just go ahead and create this manually here. And once we've done that, I'm going to go ahead and activate my virtual environment and install Chalice. So Chalice is just a Python package. You can use pip to install it. And once that's done, you will have the Python library for Chalice where you can import and use in your app. And then you also have a CLI here. We can just double check we have that installed. So there's a number of commands here. And the first one we're going to look at, which you usually use to get started, is this new project command. So in this example here, I'm just going to run Chalice new project and give it a name. We'll call it demo app. And we'll notice that it created a demo app directory for us. And in that directory, there are a number of files that it automatically generated. And we'll look at this app.py. So if you remember in the slides, we said this was really the only thing you need to get a basic Chalice app up and running. And what we have here are the same three components that we saw. And we'll look at some of the commented out stuff in a second. I'm not actually going to make any changes. We'll just immediately run Chalice deploy here. And what this is going to do is go through and figure out all the resources it needs to deploy. It'll generate an IAM role for us. It will create the deployment package, which has all of our dependencies that we need, including the Chalice runtime. It will also create a Lambda function for us. And then finally, it'll create the API gateway portion, which is that Swagger document, and then an actual REST API. And so now, oh, and one more thing. Instead of using curl, I'll go ahead and just use HTTP. It just has some nice syntax highlighting, and it formats the HTTP request really nicely. So if we test this out, I can make an HTTP request. And you'll see that I get my hello world example here. So I have an app fully up and running. This is running on API Gateway and Lambda, and you saw about 30 seconds after running Chalice deploy, we have our application just up and running. Now I'll give a quick tour. We won't have time to look at all of the features of Chalice here, but I'll give you a quick tour of some of the most common things. So here's a few examples, and this just came as part of the generated code, but one of the things Chalice can do, so you can create any arbitrary routes here, but also it does name capture. So if I surround a parameter in these curly braces here, you can see it's called name, which then gets passed as a parameter to a function, which then we're actually going to just map back or echo back to the original client. So if I make a request to hello James, I'm going to get hello and then James mapped back. And the other thing that I want to show in this second example here is how you can support different HTTP methods. So here we're saying that you have to send an HTTP post. And once you get a post, you have to send some sort of body here. And the way you access the body, Chalice maps all of that for you. So there's this app.currentRequest. And within the current request object, there's a number of attributes. But the one that we're going to be looking at is JSON body here. So we'll just go ahead and put that back. And then what we're going to do is just echo that back to the user. So we'll just echo it back under the user key. So now if I save this, if I want to deploy my changes again, I just run Chalice deploy. So that's the basic workflow. Make a change to your app.py file, run Chalice deploy. It figures out what needs to get changed. And we'll go ahead and run through those new APIs that we just added. So just to refresh your memory here, we have hello name. So if we try that out, if I make an HTTP request to hello and then say James, what this will do is pass this name value into the function and then return it back to me. We'll go ahead and see that. And again, if I put anything there, it just echoes it back to me. And then the other one was being able to echo a post request. So just to show that real quick, if we take a post request and let's say username, say my GitHub username, and then just do an HTTP post, and I believe that was to users, we'll get this echoed back to me. And again, this can be any JSON document. This is just mapping that post body back into my response. So that was a quick tour of Chalice. We'll switch back to the slides now, and we'll look at a couple more examples in just a minute. But hopefully that gives you an idea of the workflow and some of the things that Chalice really helps in your serverless application development. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the second part, and this second part and the third part are combined together. And we'll see how we're able to evolve our application here. But in our sample application, it's going to be a pretty simple application. The only new thing we're adding here is, let's say that there's some existing resource, say an Amazon DynamoDB table, and we want to be able to integrate it into our app. Now, what we're going to do here, and we're going to see this a few times repeated, but what we want to do is go from taking an idea and quickly iterating on it. So usually, I mean, ideally, we would want to just be able to develop on our local dev laptop, get everything working, test it out. It's a very quick feedback loop. And once we're happy with whatever application we have, the next thing we would do is then deploy it to, say, our own personal dev account or a dev stack. And so this is something that we just have access to, but we can actually get it running on Amazon API Gateway and AWS Lambda. And we might iterate back and forth there, making some changes on our local dev laptop and then switching over to the dev stack. But once we're happy with that, we're going to look at how to take that last step, which is taking something you have running on your own account, and then set up a full CD pipeline here, with the idea being that I have some sort of thing that I can push to, in this case, a Git repository. And whenever I push to that Git repository, it's then able to automatically deploy changes to me, or changes for me. So if I have a team that's collaborating on a project, as long as I have access to this repository, anyone can push and then deploy an application. So we're going to look at how we evolve for each of these stages here, and we'll see how Chalice is able to help us during this process. Now, for the first part, we're just going to focus on the local dev laptop and the dev stack for the second portion here. And we'll just hop right back over to the demo here, and we'll see how we can get all of this set up. So the first thing I'm going to do is just, again, use this Chalice new project, and we'll call this URL shortener. So just as an example, we're just using this as a motivating example here. Let's say that we wanted to have a really basic app that you send it a URL and it sends you a shortened link, and then you can request that link again and it'll give you a redirect. And then, we would add maybe analytics or some sort of stats collection to it, but we'll look at how to start that process and get it all set up. So in order to save some time here, and you don't have to watch me type all of this, I'm going to go ahead and just copy over the app.py, and we'll walk through it, and we'll see how we get all of this stuff set up. So there's a couple of new things here. I'm going to walk pretty quickly through this, but first few things here. So this is a new thing. We have an app.debug. That's just giving us additional information when there are errors. We can see stack traces and everything. And then now we're introducing a Bodo 3 client. So if you notice, I imported that at the top there. That's the AWS SDK for Python. And we have a DynamoDB client here. So this demo app just has 2 URLs here. And in the 2 URLs, it was just what we talked about. You can send a post request to get a URL shortened. And then on this next line here, or this part here, you can send that shortened URL and then get the redirect. So a couple of interesting things that I want to mention here are that the first thing we're doing when we finally get to the DynamoDB part and we want to put whatever the shortened URL is into Dynamo, because that's how we're going to track it, we need to know what the table name is. And so rather than having a hard-coded table name, what we're going to do is pull it from the environment variable. And so that way, if we have say a different table name in our dev stack versus our prod stack, we can map that and not have to make any code changes. And we're pulling that from app.table, or from app table name. And then similarly here, when we get the item, we're going to look it up in the app table name. So the way we do that, and I'll switch over and show you how to do that, I have an existing DynamoDB table here. This would be, if I had a table that was maybe managed in a different application lifecycle, or I had an existing table that now I want to add a REST API onto. So I have this table here called local demo, and all we need to do is tell Chalice to map this into our environment variables for us. So there's a config file in Chalice, and it has a number of features here. One of the ones we're going to look at now is environment variable mapping. So for each of these stages, I can specify a set of environment variables I want mapped. And what we're going to use here is just that one variable we looked at, which was app table name. And remember, it was called local demo. Now, I can actually map different, so we won't see an example of this here, but if I wanted to, say, have a prod stage with a different set of resources, I could then have an environment variables mapping for a different table name. And I can also set table names globally as well, which we're not going to look at, but just to give you an idea of some of the options you have for configuration. So I have this environment variables mapping here. And the first thing I want to do is actually just test this out. So we haven't deployed anything to API Gateway. There's nothing that's actually happened yet. But what we want to do first is just run this on a dev server, an HTTP server running locally. And we have to do one more thing before we start that, which is to install Bodo 3. You notice we imported that at the top, so we do need that installed so that when we run our app, it actually doesn't get any import errors. And now what we're going to do is run the Chalice local. So if we run Chalice local, what we'll see is it spins up a server on localhost. And this is emulating part of API Gateway's routing so that we can test this without having to deploy to API Gateway. So now that we have this running, let's see how we can actually test it. So as an example, you send it a JSON body, and we'll send, let's say, AWS Amazon.com. And then we just need to send a post request, if you remember, to that root URL, so localhost port 8000. And if everything's set up right, we should get a shortened URL here. So we get this little identifier. And then if we wanted to retrieve it, all we do is do an HTTP GET request to this identifier. And you can see we're getting a redirect. So this is our location header. And if we switch back over to our local console here, you can see there was the post request that came in and then a GET request. And again, that mapped to these two views here. One thing I do want to mention that wasn't pointed out before was this custom response. This is actually how we're sending the redirect. So Chalice has this response object that you can import, and that allows you to have control over the status code, the headers that you want, as well as the body. And so that's what we're using to send a redirect response. Okay, so if you remember from our slides, that was the first column. What we're going to do now is look at the second column, which was how we actually deploy to API Gateway on our local or on our own dev stack. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is run Chalice deploy. It's the same workflow again. And we should see something that's new here. We haven't seen this yet. What it's saying is it wants to apply this execution policy for us. And we're going to go ahead and say yes, but one of the things that Chalice does is scans your source code, and it understands how Boto3's imports and client creation works, and it noticed we're using getItem and putItem, so it suggested that as a policy that we should use. Now, we actually give you a lot of control over how you want to manage your AWS resources or in your policies. So you can let us auto-generate it, which is good if you're just getting started. You also can just provide a policy on your own if you want to manually write a policy. And then you can also provide a role ARN. So if you have an existing role and you don't want us to manage any of that, you can just let us know the role ARN. And all of that is configured through that Chalice config file. So now that we have that, grab the URL. So we've deployed this to API Gateway, and we're just going to go ahead and test this again. So we should be able to use the same stuff we used before and then just send this post request to the actual API Gateway URL. And if everything worked, we should get a response back, and we do. And then again, we can test that we can retrieve it. So if we do a GET request, we'll also get that response back. And the way this is working in Lambda, again, Chalice will map the environment variables for that table name into the Lambda function. So there's no difference from when we were testing it locally versus running it in Lambda. Okay, so at this point we've tested it locally. We have it working on our dev stack. Now, the last thing we want to do is figure out how we can actually get a deployment pipeline going. So this takes a few minutes to set up. So what I'm going to do is kick off the process here, and then we'll switch back to the slides in just a few minutes and then talk about how we set all that up. So Chalice gives you a couple of things to help with setting up a deployment pipeline. The command we're going to look at here is generate pipeline. So the way this works, you run Chalice, generate pipeline, and you give it a file name here. And if we run help, it actually gives us a sample command for how to set this up. So this generated a CloudFormation stack that has all the various resources we need to kick off this process. So I'm going to go ahead and just start this, and then we'll talk about what happened here. So we'll call it demo pipeline. And we'll go ahead and copy this. And if you're not familiar with the CLI, the CloudFormation deploy command, what this is doing is it's going to create a change set, execute the change set, and then pull until the stack is complete or the create is completed. And while we're waiting for that to go ahead and deploy, I just wanted to highlight one thing here, which is the starter template that it gives you. And I should mention, the idea here is that once you generate this, you would customize it to whatever your specific use cases are. This is just so that you don't have to start entirely from scratch. But one of the things that we're going to leverage immediately is the outputs. So with any CloudFormation template, you can map a number of outputs. And the one that we need right now is the source repo URL. So the source repo URL is just the remote HTTPS endpoint from this code commit repository. And so this is what we're going to use to push our changes to. This is what we're going to use for our Git repo. And ideally, or I mean, the workflow would be that once we have this set up, anyone on your team would then clone this repo, make their changes, and push it back and kick off this deployment. So looks like our stack is finished creating. So we'll go ahead and just grab that output. So if I run stack name and then this stack name of demo pipeline, we should be able to look at the output. And so remember, this was that source repo's URL here. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this. And we will add a remote here. So first thing, I should make a Git repository, or make this a Git repo. And I will add the necessary parts here. So we need our app, our requirements file, and our config file. And let me just double check that Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. So the first thing we're going to do here is add a remote. So we'll do git remote add. Let me just pasted this in. So we'll call it code commit. So I'm adding a remote here. And then before I make the change, there's one other part here that I want to make sure I don't miss, and that's when we deploy our application, we want to make sure that we're using the specific versions of Boto 3 and Boto Core that we want. So I'm going to paste them into our requirements.txt file. I'll go ahead and re-add that. Okay, now that we have all of that added, we'll go ahead, and we don't actually need to do this, but just so that we have a copy of our policy checked in, we'll go ahead and do it. So we have everything added so far. We'll go ahead and commit this and say this is our initial commit. And remember, we've set up our code commit repository. The last thing we need to do is just add the code commit helper, and all that did, it's just an alias I have that just adds these extra lines to your git config for you. So now that we have that, we should be able to just run git push code commit master. And if everything's set up, it will push to code commit. Great. Okay, so this is going to take a few minutes to set up. So while that's happening, we're going to switch back to the slides, and I'll explain how all of this kind of fits together. Okay, so in this deployment pipeline, we're using a couple of AWS services in order to make all of this happen. And remember, this is all for this pipeline here on the end that's going to automatically deploy our changes. So this third column here on the right. As far as the services we're using, the main service that's driving everything together is this code pipeline. It's a continuous delivery service. You create all of your pipeline definitions in JSON, and it allows you to have a consistent release process. So you model every stage of how things get deployed. Now, as you saw me just set up, the Git repo we're using here is created by AWS Code Commit. It's a fully managed source control service. And with just a few lines of code, we're able to get that up and running and get that configured, and it works with Git. We just added that credential helper, and then everything works. The next service we're going to use is AWS Code Build. And what this does is allows us to take our app and then build it into a form that can be deployed by AWS code pipeline. And there's a number of options that you have for deployments. What we're actually going to lean on is AWS CloudFormation. So we've used CloudFormation to set up the pipeline, but we're also using CloudFormation to deploy our app. And with this, you create a template, a JSON or a YAML template that describes all of the AWS resources. And Chalice has support for AWS CloudFormation and can generate templates for you that represent your application. Now, I want to walk through the flow of data here and show you how we're able to get our application deployed. So on the left-hand side, there would be my laptop, which we just saw me push to. And right before we switched to the slides, I had ran git push. And so that pushed our changes to code commit. And what happens here is as soon as the changes get to code commit, the pipeline kicks off. And so we'll walk through the various stages here. The first stage is that it's going to create in S3 this object for the current version of our code. And from that, it's going to feed into code build. So code build is going to take that S3 object, and it's going to run a couple of scripts that we've configured. So the scripts that we've configured here are, and we'll look at them in just a second, but a packaging command that's going to generate a SAM template. A SAM template is a serverless application model, and we'll come back to that in a second. But after it generates a SAM template, that feeds into this last stage, which is the CloudFormation stage. And this CloudFormation stage is going to take that template and actually deploy our app, and now our application will be represented as a CloudFormation stack. Now, just to come back to the SAM template here, the SAM template stands for AWS Serverless Application Model. And really what it does is it gives you a couple of higher level resources on top of CloudFormation. So the two that we're using are the AWS serverless function, which is a higher level abstraction over an AWS Lambda function. And then we're also using the AWS serverless API, which is an abstraction over API gateway. Now, let's hop over here. So what I want to do now is show you how all of that is kind of configured together. So real quickly, as we've kicked off the deployment pipeline here, I'm going to hop over to the console because I think it's really nice to just show there's a nice visual representation here. And so we'll see where we're at with the code pipeline. Okay, so it's going through a couple of stages now. Remember, these were the three components we just saw on the slides: the source, the build, and then here we're just showing a beta stage. But I wanted to show you what the code build stage is doing here. So this was something that was auto-generated as part of that generate pipeline. But the one thing that I'm going to show that Chalice helps with is this package command. So if we look at all the commands that were run as part of this build process, there is this Chalice package command. And so this is where we get the integration points between Chalice and then CloudFormation and serverless application models. We can actually run this locally too. This is just running in code build so that it's able to create something that can be deployed by CloudFormation. But if I hop over here, back to the terminal, and I can run Chalice package, and then I can give it some directory. We'll just call it demo package here. This is actually creating two things for us. It's creating a deployment package that you would use in Lambda. So with Lambda, you have to send a zip file that has all your dependencies, the code that you want to run, and everything all as one contained unit. And you can actually just see that real quick. So it has, our app, it has Chalice, it has the dependencies we had to pull in for Boto Core and Boto 3. It has all of that set up for us. And then the other thing it generates is the SAM file. So the SAM is the SAM template for us. So we essentially saw the package command transform our app into a CloudFormation, or in this case, a SAM template. And we won't go through all of this here, but just to show you a couple of things. There is the AWS Serverless API. So that's part of the SAM spec there. And then in this definition body, this is a Swagger file that it's auto-generated for us. And you can notice it maps to the two parts of the API we saw, the identifier, as well as the post request here. And then finally, there is this serverless function here, which maps to the Lambda function that we need to create for our code. And it references this deployment zip file here. So this is the thing that's local, and this is where you can use all the SAM tooling to deploy your app. So if I wanted to, I could actually, and we don't have time to show this, but I can actually use any tools that work with CloudFormation to deploy my app. So I can use, the CLI. So you would use CloudFormation, and then there's a package and deploy command to deploy this. So at this point, any tooling you have with CloudFormation will work, which is how we're able to get this integration with Code Pipeline. Okay, and now we can see that the CloudFormation template has created the change set and actually executed it. And we'll hop over to that. And we can see that the creation is complete. So this was all the stuff that it just created here. And in our outputs, we have an endpoint URL. So notice this is a different URL than what we saw previously with Chalice deploy. So it's created a brand new set of resources for this stack. And if I copy this address, we should be able to test what we've been doing previously. So we'll look at this post request. And notice this URL here, we're going to replace it. So this URL is going to be replaced with this URL here. Okay, so if we got everything set up, we should be able to make a post request. All right, and we grab a shortened URL here. And then similarly, we can test it. If we do a GET request to that shortened URL, we should get our redirect. Awesome. Okay, so at this point, what we have is a deployment pipeline set up. And for example, if I wanted to, let's say, get in here and make a change. So maybe I'll just add the version key, and then I'll say added a version key. Now at this point, if I wanted to push my changes to code commit, this would kick off the deployment pipeline. And so we don't have time to see this go through its full stage here, but what you would see in a few minutes was this start to say, okay, we're at the source stage, then going to the code build stage, and then eventually it would automatically deploy my change just by me pushing to code commit. All right, So let's switch back to the slides here and we can finish up. So just to recap here, we looked at three main things in this webinar. We looked at how Chalice helps you write serverless applications. And then in the next two sections, we saw how we took a sample app and we just evolved it from something working locally to something working on our dev laptop, and then finally setting up a full CD pipeline. So some of the next steps you would go from here is maybe fleshing out more of that pipeline, adding additional stages, adding additional testing stages to it, and starting to iterate on that. There's a lot more features in Chalice we didn't have time to cover. Everything from user authentication to built-in authorizers, which lets you manage a Lambda function to do custom authorization, and Chalice manages all of the deployment for you. In addition to scheduled events, cores, a number of other things that we just don't have time to cover. However, all of that is in the documentation, so our docs are on Read the Docs. And as I mentioned, it's fully open source on GitHub, so there's the link to the repository. So come and try it out, file any issues and feature requests you want. And then finally, there's a link on Gitter. So if you want to come chat with us, we're also available on Gitter. All right, thanks everyone. I think now we'll switch over to